but while we get that going, good morning, everyone. I'm Ariel Rivers, NACD's Pacific Region representative, and I will facilitate this 1-hour NACD Urban and Community Conservation webinar. Thank you for joining us to learn about urban forest canopy cover during this joint webinar with NACD's Forest Resource Policy Group. We will record this webinar and post it on NACD's website along with a PDF of the presentations for future access. Please share widely with your networks and anyone who may be interested in seeing this or previous presentations. Please keep yourself muted for the duration of today's call. After the presentations, we'll have a question and answer session. Please type your questions in the chat box and I will read them out loud so that we can address them for the recording as well. Now I will turn it over to Alex Schmidt, who will provide a few introductory comments. Alex is chair of NACD's Urban and Community Resource Policy Group, which is part of our Natural Resources Policy Committee. Alex?
Good morning and welcome to the monthly Urban and Community Conservation webinar offered by the National Association of Conservation Districts through generous support from our sole sponsor, the Scotts Miracle-Gro Company. These sessions are designed by NACD's Urban and Community Policy Group, a subcommittee of district officials and partners charged with guiding the association's services and support for districts' work in developed and developing areas. Our goal through these webinars is to help districts share what they're doing nationwide and enable them to learn from each other and various agencies and organizations. We appreciate the support of Scotts Miracle-Gro Foundation for making these possible. I invite you to let us know what you think about each webinar and what topics you would like us to cover by contacting our NACD staffer, Ariel Rivers. And as always, please tell the NACD leadership what type of assistance you would like to see from the National Association for your urban and community conservation work. I'll now hand it back to Ariel. Thanks.
All right, great. Thank you, Alex. Before we get started, I'd also like to briefly introduce Doug Rushton, a member of the Forestry RPG, who will also provide a few comments about the work of that group. Doug?
Great, thanks, Ariel. I would like to point out that the Forestry RPG is a resource policy group. That's what the RPG stands for, and it's essentially a subcommittee of NACD's Natural Resources Policy Committee. Believe it or not, forestry occurs in urban and community settings. The Forestry RPG, we work with local, state, regional, tribal, federal partners, particularly the NRCS, but especially the Forest Service, because they provide our funding. So that shouldn't be a big surprise to anyone. And then the National Association of State Foresters, that's your state forestry agency's leads. And we have representation on the Forestry RPG from all across the U.S. And we've got strong staff support from Mike Beacom, who I saw on this call somewhere. I'm not sure exactly where his photograph is on there. We've been able to affect various forestry initiatives across the country, such as we were on the U.S. Department of Agriculture Forest Resources Coordinating Committee, which was a group that advised the Secretary of Agriculture on forestry issues. And also we have representation on what's called the JFT, the Joint Forestry Team, which is a partnership with NRCS, the state foresters, the Forest Service, and NACD to look at forestry issues and concerns and ways we can work together even better. To stay abreast of the forestry activities, go to the NACD website and you can type in this for search forestry notes. There's a newsletter there that's electronic or paper. Suggest you do electronic. That's just a little bit greener. And then lastly, you can check out more on the Forestry RPG by going to the Forestry RPG webpage, which is also on the NACD webpage. And we're just grateful to be able to be part of this urban and community presentation. So thanks for signing up.
Great, thank you, Doug and Alex. So now I will introduce our speakers and then we'll get started. First, we'll hear from Jared Bartley, who is the Senior Program Manager for Education and Watersheds at Cuyahoga Soil and Water Conservation District. I can never pronounce that one correctly. Apologies, Jared. In Cleveland, Ohio, where he has worked since 2007, developing and implementing watershed management plans, restoration projects, and outreach programs. He has a degree in geology from Case Western Reserve University, is a certified floodplain manager, and a returned Peace Corps volunteer. having spent 2 years supporting agroforestry and community development initiatives in rural El Salvador with his wife, Christy. Jared's free time is mostly spent outdoors and volunteering for his 3 sons' scouting activities. So thank you for joining us today, Jared. Next, we'll hear from Cori Dolan, who's the program manager for the Urban and Community Forestry, Invasive Plants and Forest Health Programs at the Arizona Department of Forestry and Fire Management. Through technical assistance, grant programs, community engagement, and monitoring, these programs help move the needle on goals outlined in the state's Forest Action Plan. Cori has a bachelor's of science in entomology and a master of science in the human dimensions of fire ecology. She enjoys spending time with her family and her 13 pets. Thank you as well for joining us today, Cori. And finally, we'll hear from Ian Leahy, who since 2014 has led development of American Forest's award-winning urban forestry program that focuses on such issues as tree equity, creating career pathways into the field, and increasing technical and financial capacity in urban forestry. Prior to American Forests, Ian served as the Urban and Community Forestry Coordinator for the District of Columbia and ran a landscape design business in Michigan's Upper Peninsula. He has studied environmental management at Cornell University and Yale University. Excellent. Thank you to all of our speakers for joining us today. And with that, I'll hand it over to you, Jared, to get started.
Great, thanks. I get the screen shared here, and just a little pronunciation lesson. It is Cuyahoga, although there are many people in Cuyahoga County who incorrectly pronounce it Cuyahoga. So I stir the pot there a little bit with the other people in my office. Ongoing debate. Anyway, thanks for having me on. I'm going to be speaking about the County Healthy Urban Tree Canopy Grant Program. But first, just a little about who we are and what we do. We're a very urban district. Cuyahoga County is about 90% developed, so we don't do much with agriculture except for urban agriculture. We focus primarily on stormwater and watershed programs, both education and supporting communities implementing their MS4 permits. You can see our office building there, the original, obviously that was there well before we moved in, but it's fitting because we are the original environmental organization in Cuyahoga County. So I just want to acknowledge before we get much further here, our program partners in this, Cuyahoga County itself, specifically the Sustainability Department is the primary implementer at the county level, also the County Board of Health, County Planning Commission, and of course us, the Soil and Water Conservation District. So kind of a little background on how we got here. In 2011, the county did initial tree canopy inventory or survey and showed about 37.9% tree canopy throughout the county. They did that with a follow-up assessment in 2017. Got the data in 2019 processed and showed that that actually had gone down during that time. So now countywide, we're at 34.7%. And you can see in this image the breakdown by community with Cleveland and the kind of entering suburbs predictably having generally a lower tree canopy cover than the outer ring suburbs. Just to dig into that a little deeper, this shows the reduction between the two tree canopy surveys. So in about less than a decade, you can see where we're losing a lot of tree canopy and a couple of places where we had some modest gains. The reasons for a lot of this loss, when you get more out into the suburbs and some in the inner ring as well, it is development pressure as we continue to lose population in the city of Cleveland, but and with a lot of that moving out to the outer ring suburbs. But also, and you can see here's a map where we had tree loss greater than an acre over that time frame. And you can see a lot of this out in the suburbs. This is going to be development. Most of the over an acre sites are usually related to some sort of development activity. But during this time period, we also saw significant loss from emerald ash borer in the community, a lot of ash trees. So many communities, that'd be a whole street wiped out of street trees. Even within the Metro Parks system, which is over 24,000 acres, had significant losses due to emerald ash borer. Although those aren't as concentrated, obviously in 1 acre wouldn't show up as much on this map. Around the same time, about 2017, the county finished its climate change action plan. And one of the areas of focus was natural systems. And between the two kind of projects, between the climate change action plan and the tree canopy assessment, that really led to the idea that, hey, we need to do something about this. What can we do about this? So the county committed $5 million over 5 years towards increasing canopy in the community. This started in 2019. Oops. And it breaks down to $1 million a year. It's really $950,000 a year in competitive grants to the communities in Cuyahoga County, other nonprofit organizations within the city of Cleveland, the community development corporations, school districts, and then with the administrative fee for kind of cover the services for us and for the County Planning Commission, who does a lot of the administrative work on the grants themselves. And these were really geared towards planting, maintenance, and planning. Really, that first year we had a lot of planning grants come out of this. A lot of communities were way behind, needed to update plans, do additional inventories, things like that. We really wanted this to not just be like throwing money out there willy-nilly and trees going in wherever. We really wanted this to follow a plan. So you needed to have a plan in place to be able to access this money for the planting. And even that first year, there was a lot of even deferred maintenance activities. And one important thing here, and it's highlighted a little bit here in the last bullet point, but we also really wanted to be cautious of not replacing existing funding that had been budgeted in the communities for urban forestry. We wanted this to be something that would be in addition to. So one of the things we did require was for them to submit, their current budget figures and things like that related to the urban forestry program, and a little more detail about that, because we really wanted to not just be moving money around and replacing that money that they would then move to something else and not really have a gain on top of what would already have happened. So this is a competitive grant program, so you can see a lot of the criteria we use to evaluate the applications. I really want to point to a couple here at the bottom: the vulnerability assessment and existing tree canopy. The vulnerability assessment was something that was completed as part of the county's climate action plan. It's basically climate vulnerability, so it incorporates both natural and physical factors, but also social factors. And it was on a census block level that you could get into that. So as we're evaluating these, we'll see we would get more points for more vulnerable projects in more vulnerable areas and more vulnerable communities. Same thing with the existing tree canopy. You get a lot more points if this is going in an area where the existing tree canopy is significantly lower than the rest of the county. And then finally, just something we really wanted to hit on was the maintenance plan. As our director, Jan, who also serves on the committee with me for this program, likes to say, we want to grow trees, not just plant trees. So it's really important that we had that maintenance component in there. So our role in the program is we are part of the grant team. So we help develop the grant applications and those criteria and the weighting. We do evaluate those plans and score them, help decide on the funding. We review and approve their planting and maintenance plans to make sure that they are following best practices, and also any plans that have been developed to make sure there's a lot of leeway with what they're doing with the plans, but there's a few things we really wanted to see, like identifying locations for planting and things like that. We go out and actually monitor the tree installation and maintenance to make sure they're following their approved plans. The one image here, and the screenshot, we have an app we use for a lot of things in the office. Fulcrum, it's basically a tool where you can build your own apps for geospatial kind of work, and we can associate the photos with them. So we go out, at each of these plantings, and we have a formal record and make sure that they're following their approved plans. And then finally, we serve as a technical resource for the project partners and the grantees, just as far as what are some of these appropriate techniques for planting, maintenance, and things along those lines. So the results of the program. So in 2019, the first round, 26 grants awarded, totaling $950,000, planting over 1,400 trees, and also developing 14, or either developing new or updating 14 urban forestry plans in the communities. And through those plans, they had identified over 14,000 potential planting sites. One important note is a lot of times when we're working with the communities themselves, it's really a lot of street trees that are going in. And other times, moving between 2019 and 2021, we really tried to look at also, in addition to the street trees, getting some larger kind of restoration style plantings in. So we added some more points for that. But it's still a lot of street trees primarily in the communities, which is important. And actually completed a business plan for a nonprofit tree nursery as well. 2021, so 2020, COVID, the county wasn't sure what was happening with their budget or anything, so they took a year off from the program. It gave us time to evaluate where we were and make some changes to the program. But so again, awarded 25 grants. This time around, if there was a planting grant, they had to include planting as part of that, even if it's a small portion, just to take the emphasis on the action and the implementation. Then 20 planting grants, including one to establish a nonprofit tree nursery. With planned, this should be over 4,000 trees then in the ground. Usually, like I said, these street trees fall in burlap, larger tree stock. And so you can kind of see, again, looking back to the map, these are all the communities. You can see, you know, where planting projects were done, planting projects. City of Cleveland's highlighted because there's lots of groups within there with different projects. So, and then for 2021, the darker green is where more trees will be planted. The grayed communities are the ones that weren't funded, had applied but weren't funded this round. And then finally, just this is not a one-off thing for us working with trees and forestry. This is something we've been involved with for a long time at Cuyahoga SWCD. Kind of fits under our Cuyahoga Relief umbrella of programs, urban forestry programs. So you can, not going to go through all of them here, but just say you can check our website to find out more about these. But we have a lot of other forestry programs going on at the same time, all working towards, you know, both the goals of increasing canopy cover. A lot of these are targeted towards water quality or stormwater attenuation, working with our partners and watershed groups along the way. So thanks. That's all I have. I guess we'll have questions at the end, and I will pass it over to Cori.
While I'm pulling this up, I will let you know that even though I'm coming to you now from Arizona, I did grow up in Cleveland. And if I ever decide to move home, Jared, I'm coming your way for a job.
We're waiting for you.
Okay. So tell me, Ariel, if you are seeing my slides or somebody. Yes, I see it shaking head. All right. So actually, a lot of what I was going to tell you today about urban and community forestry state coordinators is very much related and will sound very similar to what Jared was telling you, but our scale is just a little bit bigger. So we at the state level do the same things that Jared was talking about, but we just have a larger area that we're looking to engage with. So I'll just kind of go back to the beginning though. So every state has an urban and community forestry program that is funded through the Cooperative Forestry Assistance Act. And if you're not familiar with that act, it is also known as the Farm Bill. And that act, included in that legislation was a mechanism for the Forest Service to send money to support urban and community forestry programs in each state. And they do that through an annual consolidated grant agreement to a state agency for base salaries. And then they also give us some pass-through dollars so that we can supply grants to nonprofits, schools, much the same partners that Jared was talking about that do projects on the ground. In order to be eligible for that funding through the Forest Service, every state has to meet these 4 requirements. One of them is that they have to have at least one full-time coordinator like myself. And that coordinator's job is to provide technical assistance to communities. And we do that in a couple of different ways, which I'm going to give you some examples in a couple more slides. The third thing is we have to convene a community forestry council or some sort of forestry advisory board. So we work pretty closely with a board that's made up of diverse forestry professionals, industry folks, municipal foresters, academics, students, and they all help us in a couple of different ways. One main way is to help us with the fourth requirement, which is creating a strategic plan. So every urban and community forestry state program has to be operating under a strategic plan that just helps us kind of narrow the action items that we're going to be implementing over that time period. And how is that going? How are those action items going to help us make an impact in the communities and prioritize where our funding is going? So state coordinators can be housed in different agencies throughout a state. Many, like myself, are in the state forestry agency, but some of my colleagues in other states are in the Department of Natural Resources, Agriculture, or even the state land department. And their jobs can have different scopes. If it's a small state and they maybe don't get as much base funding from their regional US Forest Service office, maybe they just do straight urban forestry. If they're like mine and they have come from a larger state, maybe they have a lot of different roles. So in my case, I have to cover urban forestry, conservation education, forest health, and invasive plants. So what does this mean on the ground? I think a lot of this is going to sound similar to what Jared was saying, but our role is really to engage with communities and get them set up to do urban forestry on their own. And so I'm just going to run through 4 examples of what that looks like on the ground here in Arizona. And the first is, like I mentioned before, that competitive grant program. We get pass-through dollars from the Forest Service every year, and we pass that right on through to municipalities, tribes, nonprofits, and universities to help them do on-the-ground projects. The next example is most state coordinators, actually I would say all state coordinators, are responsible for administering the Tree City USA program in their state. If you're not familiar with Tree City, I'm happy to give you more information, but it basically is a recognition program through the Arbor Day Foundation, and it just recognizes cities that go the extra mile towards supporting urban forestry in their city. And so it's my job and the state coordinator's job to help cities get recertified every year, and to also help cities that want to get recognized for the first time figure out what they need to do in order to get there. I wanted to give you an example of a much larger scale project that we might be doing at the state level. And here's just one example. The city of Yuma has a stretch of the Colorado River. And so we got a $600,000 grant to do what we call the Yuma West Wetlands Landscape Scale Restoration Project. And we use that funding to remove a significant amount of invasive species right along the river, opening it up to a more park-like setting, and bringing back access to the river for that community. We also use the money to plant natives in that area. We put in some trails, we put in some educational signs, we made some videos. We created some lesson plans for teachers so that when they go to this park, they can do some urban forestry related lesson plans there with their students. And then the last piece of this project is we're actually doing a training for the City of Yuma landscape and Parks and Rec staff on things like proper planting, pruning, maintaining trees. We're also going to include information like tree biology, so they understand what the tree needs and why they need it, and things like what insects and diseases are they likely to come across in that park and how might they manage that. So just passing along some of this information to the folks that actually touch the trees in that park. And then the last thing that most state coordinators do is they need to provide written and electronic resources for their state. Normally these programs are 1 or 2 people at most, and they have a whole state to cover. So we spend a lot of time creating resources that we can give out. And here's just one example that we're doing here in Arizona. We're creating what we call the pest readiness guide. It's actually going to cover Arizona and New Mexico because those are the two states in my region that have the same planting zones mostly, so we can crosswalk the information to cover both states. And this is just an example of one page from that pest readiness guide. You heard Jared mention emerald ash borer, and it can really have devastating effects. So we don't have emerald ash borer in Arizona yet, but we do expect that it will be here sooner rather than later. So this is a readiness guide that helps us, what is emerald ash borer? How do you identify it? Once you do identify it, what should you do? Who should you call? And then what are some management solutions or strategies for dealing with that? So it's really a guide for the folks who are on the ground doing urban forestry in their communities. So that's just one example of the resource that we're creating. And all of that is really meant to illustrate what an urban and community forestry program at the state level is meant to do, which is to promote the planting, maintenance, protection, and restoration of urban forests. And the emphasis of the state level programming is to help communities create a self-sustaining program at the local level. So now I'm just gonna pivot a little bit to, I was asked to talk a little bit about forest action plans. And so going back to that farm bill that we mentioned in the beginning of the talk, it also mandates that in order to qualify for federal funds, every state has to have a forest action plan. And currently in the United States, every state does have a forest action plan. And if you're curious and you want to read yours or see what's in it, you can go to the National Association of State Foresters website that Doug mentioned in the beginning and click on your state, and you should have access to your state plan there. The forest action plan is mandated to be reviewed every 5 years, and the responsibility for developing that belongs to the state forester, who will usually appoint a task force group to bring that together. And the purpose of a forest action plan, as outlined in the Farm Bill, is to do 3 things. They really wanted to cover how are you going to conserve working forest lands, how are you going to protect forests from harm, and how are you going to enhance the public benefits from trees and forests. And you can see how an urban and community forestry program would really help address some of those things. So the parts of a forest action plan, if you haven't read one before, they do vary from state to state, depending on what the resources are and what the threats to those resources are. But in most forest action plans, you're going to find sections analyzing the forest resources in that state. What are the current conditions? What are the desired conditions? What is or could cause harm to those resources? How are you going to protect them in terms of what are very specific action items that are going to address the patterns and threats that you see for your resources? It typically outlines who can help you do that. So what opportunities are there? What partners and stakeholders exist? And what other resources do you need to pull off those action items? And the last thing that a forest action plan will typically do is it will acknowledge the other plans that already exist at the state level. And here I put in 2 really common examples. Most states have a wildlife action plan and several community wildfire protection plans. So a forest action plan will cover how it is going to interact with those other plans. And so my final slide here, I just wanted to kind of wrap it up with kind of how I see all of these different pieces informing and interacting with each other. And mostly at the state level, the Urban and Community Forestry Strategic Plan really guides my program. And I get every 4 years, mostly every 4 years, different priorities that come at me from the Forest Service. So every administration has different priorities that it sets out for itself. And then those get funneled down to me, and I incorporate those into the strategic plan, or I see how the projects that we are currently doing might help address some of those federal priorities. And then I funnel those back up into the forest action plan, so we can make sure that our forest action plan does address some of those national priorities as well. And then in return, the forest action plan specifically so much information about wildfire suppression. That's a huge part of a forest action plan. How are you going to reduce the intensity and severity of wildfire in your state? And that's big in Arizona anyway. So how can the Urban and Community Forestry Program address that? So the Forest Action Plan is informing us. But one really important piece, I think, of the Urban and Community Forestry Program and its strategic plan is that we spend 100% of our time engaging with the public. And that community engagement, the community are informing us about what their needs are, what they need to know, what they don't know, and how we can help them. And so I really think that the state coordinators' one of their main focuses is to make sure that that information gets funneled up back into the Forest Action Plan so that our state level plan can include information that comes directly from the constituents that we are trying to serve. And that's my presentation. Thank you. And stop sharing. Okay, I think I did it.
So much. Again, I'm Ian Leahy. I'm with American Forests. So I'm going to be coming from the nonprofit, national nonprofit perspective here, talking about this concept of tree equity, a term we coined to address, really draw attention to the issue of inequitable tree canopy across cities. So if you're not familiar with us, we've been around since 1875. We're actually the oldest conservation organization in the country. We've most notably been doing urban forestry for over 100 years of that time, which is very unique. Most people were not paying attention to urban conservation until pretty recently. So this focus on tree equity is because the inequity has major consequences. I think when we were growing up, trees in cities were kind of seen as, you know, backdrop. They were nice to have. People weren't really against them, but they were window dressing. And now as our cities are heating up, as Boston's projected to have summers that feel like Miami Beach by the end of this century, these tree canopy is becoming a critical life-saving infrastructure for people who can't afford air conditioning, for people who work outside, who are commuting outside, and just need that layer of protection and buffering. And of course, it's not random that wealthier areas tend to have more tree canopy cover than lower income areas, as well as communities of color. Forest Service has done research that's found a very direct relationship between communities that were redlined decades ago, which means the federal government created maps that dissuaded investment mortgages and such in certain neighborhoods. So what we're trying to do now is overcome those structural issues. Okay, so that's kind of the brief problem statement. Now I want to get into the solution side of a big part of tree equity is it's really looking at full cycle urban forestry. If you're not familiar with urban forestry, it operates just like rural forestry, but in a very, very different physical context. I think our field got a little addicted to just planting trees for a while there. So we're really trying to look at that bigger picture of protecting trees, creating jobs to maintain trees, creating wood products, and propagating the right trees for the future. Part of that is making sure that we're growing trees that are going to be adapted for future climate. So we do climate vulnerability assessment studies with NIACS, the Northern Institute of Applied Climate Science at the Forest Service, to see what the climate's going to be in 50 years and what species are going to be suited for that. And as part of that is propagating the genetic resistant specimen to things like emerald ash borer, so that we're growing trees that are not going to get wiped out by the next pest or disease infestation. The bulk of what I want to focus on here, the foundation of our work, is this new tool we just rolled out recently called Tree Equity Score. It's totally free, treeequityscore.org. You can go play around on it. And it's basically designed to not just do a study, but really give you tools and to identify where investments are needed and track progress toward achieving those goals. It's basically structured around a collection of these data sets. So on one hand, you have tree canopy data. We work with Earth Define to roll out the first nationwide layer. So every community, big or small, where there's 50,000 people or more in the area has a tree equity score done for them now. And then these socioeconomic factors from income, employment, surface temperature, ethnicity, age, and really just synthesizing those into a point system. So that it can be, what we're really, it's not that doing that layering was particularly new in our field, but it wasn't really tracking as a narrative. So we were really trying to create a narrative that a resident on the street corner, a mayor could just pick up on a second and figure out where their need is. And it's a pretty nuanced calculation. It's designed so that if an area starts changing socioeconomically, the value of that tree within this system declines as a place where planting is needed. So you're always optimized for where trees are most needed for the most socioeconomic benefits. And we have two applications for this. I'll walk through at the end. Tree Equity Score, the National Explorer. This is the free tool that's every community has nationwide. And then on the right here is the Analyzer. We piloted this in Rhode Island. We're building out a few others. These are on spec, and they're really a much deeper dive tool. They get down to the parcel level, that you do custom project level scenarios, and just really get to that more nuanced level of analysis. So it's important that we don't just throw a number out and walk away. We've built a suite of tools to support really addressing numbers at the community level and the city agency level, the state level. One of these is on Vibrant Cities Lab, which is a website we developed with the Forest Service. This Climate and Health Action Guide is really designed, this is on the more technical side, designed for urban forestry professionals or city managers to look and make some really strategic decisions of how to optimize their urban forest, specifically for public health benefits as well as climate. For a long time, urban forests were seen as more of an adaptation strategy alone, but data has actually made clear that urban forests contribute a lot directly to slowing global warming, and they're doing it on the front lines where it's most needed. So as part of that guide is a species selection tool. Again, we're looking out for 50 years. We're looking at carbon sequestration and public health benefits. And we try to put it in a tool that's here, or a format that, just someone who doesn't think about trees every day like we do could just pick up and be like, okay, we need to put a box elder in here that, that you can just have, you can figure out where your best options are. And so we've done this in Rhode Island. We're going to be building it for this tool with NIAX again for a few other cities. And then we built this one a few years ago, but I just want to make sure you're aware that it's a valuable tool. It's all free, self-assessment. It gives you a gap score. You go through all these criteria for what it takes to build an effective urban forestry program. It's based on academic analyses that were done. And it just looks at everything from data to breaking down silos between agencies to community engagement, just everything you could think of. And you determine where you feel like you are right now. And it tells you, you set your goal where you want to be within whatever timeline makes sense for you and whatever budget you're working with. And it just helps you track progress toward building the ideal urban forestry program for your community. So great, where's the money? Everybody loves this stuff, but our field is chronically underfunded. Our city foresters across the country do heroic work on shoestring budgets. And we end up a lot of times doing assessments and then 5 years later coming back and doing another assessment, but never really getting that surge of money to address the problems that are identified 5 years ago. So that I should mention real quick that funding action guide is also on Vibrant Cities Lab for someone just really designed for starting out, really thinking through everything to make yourself competitive for funding. So there's a number of options. Impact bonds have become popular, particularly at the state level. City Forest Credits, they're a nonprofit based in Seattle. If you're familiar with voluntary carbon markets, it's basically that, but geared toward city environments. They just released a national sale of carbon credits. So it's a really great way to quantify the impact for both planting and preservation. And then last on the funding piece, we at American Forest do a lot of work in federal policy. There's a lot of momentum, like the light bulb just went off across the aisle. Both Republicans and Democrats have a lot of momentum. There's a number of big bills that could really be transformational for our field. States have gotten involved. This is Rhode Island, where we piloted a lot of this work. So there's a good potential for a big surge of money coming from federal that the private sector and state and such can match, but at least be a stimulus to get in. And then, okay, so money hopefully coming in, but even if it doesn't for some reason, there's a big labor shortage in our field in the tree care industry already. So part of our work, we have an initiative called Career Pathways, and you can see here that these are well-paying jobs. The ground worker is still making a living wage at over $15 an hour, and it just goes up from there. And so this is a field that a lot of people don't know exists, frankly. It's one of our biggest hurdles is just getting people where these jobs. A lot of people would rather spend their days climbing trees, having an adventuresome career rather than working behind a counter somewhere. So it's appealing to that audience. And so what we do, we look across the whole spectrum of our work, from community engagement, doing youth education, introducing them to these careers. And then we have pre-apprenticeship training programs that we work across the country to help them align with Department of Labor standards for apprenticeships. And then in some cases, we place people directly into jobs specifically. And we also are in the process of developing out a track into 2-year, 4-year programs. So we're diversifying our field, just helping to get the best talent we can into it to replace the population that's aging out. And this tree core with Tazo Tea company that we've developed is putting people directly into jobs with Davy, and they're being provided wraparound services. They're being, we're making sure that any issues on cultural with the field crews around misogyny or any policies, or just making sure we're really getting as inclusive a situation as we can, because there's a lot of turnover after the first year in our field. So given time, I won't show you this video, but I will, let me a quick little walkthrough of the tool itself. I hope, yeah, you should be able to still see it. So we're just zoomed in on Philly right now as an example. You can just scan over, you can see what the tree equity score is for every neighborhood. And you can see down here, it gives you just a little map of like what's driving that score, people of color and high temperatures in this particular one. And then this is for the National Explorer. You can just go right to a municipal report. So Philadelphia overall doesn't have a bad score, but as you can see, as we scroll down, there's a very direct relationship. As communities of color increase, the tree canopy plummets. Same with poverty rate. As poverty rate increases, the tree canopy plummets, and temperature. So this is a good, easy way to just tell the story, tell our narrative to different audiences. And you can come down here and look at, okay, we say we want to get every census block group in the city up to 75, a score of at least 75. So that's going to require 104,000 medium-sized trees, and you can just start scrolling up from there. To get up to 100, you're almost to a million more trees to get all those up. And then lastly, this is iTree data, which is a Forest Service tool. So as you move those numbers, it's giving you calculations of how much you're impacting, your ecosystem service impacts are. So I will stop there and appreciate the time. Thank you.
All right, great. Thank you everyone for these very informative presentations. I definitely learned a lot, and I really appreciate your time sharing this information with us. So I would like to remind everyone to put your questions in the chat box, and I'll read those out loud so that we can make sure to capture those for the recording. And we have had one question. This was during Jared's presentation, but I want to make sure to capture it again. The question by Kim Jordan was, are grants only made to cities, communities with conservation districts? And where she lives, Philly does not currently have one, but they do have high levels of need to increase tree canopy, as we just saw from that great tool that you shared, Ian. So I don't know if any of our panelists have any additional thoughts to share regarding funding, and specifically to groups other than conservation districts. And we did see that Ian shared that great funding guide as well. So Ian, if you have a link to that, if you could share that in the chat box, that would be fantastic. But I think that we did see from both Cori and Ian's presentations that there are resources out there for a variety of organizations.
Yeah, I would say one way you could find out for like what if the state of Pennsylvania has a coordinator like me, which they do, and you don't know who that is or which agency they're sitting in, you can go to the Arbor Day Foundation's website, and it actually has a map there, and it will tell you who is the listed state coordinator for your state. Then I would encourage you to reach out to them and ask them if they have a competitive grant program, because as long as you're like, the grants won't be able to go to an individual person or a private homeowner, but if you're a nonprofit, a municipality, a tribe, a school, there's lots of ways to get that money where it needs to go.
Excellent, thank you. And Ian just noted in the chat box as well that there's a sample list of funders for every state in the guide that he linked. So thank you, Ian, for including that information too. All right, next we have a question from Doug Rushton. Ian, do you have any specific comments on how much you interact with or coordinate with conservation districts?
Yeah, I was just going to answer that one next. I would say that there's room for improvement there. We've had conversations, we've explored partnerships in some locations, but I think there's a lot of opportunity there to expand that.
Excellent, thank you. And if there's anything that we can do, or Doug, who sits on the Forestry RPG, to help facilitate those conversations, we of course would be happy to do that too. Next up, we have a question from Elizabeth Tompkins. What percentage of the trees planted in your program are planted by volunteers, groups, as opposed to county or other staff? So Jared, why don't we look to you for that question?
So through the Healthy Urban Tree Canopy Grant Program, it's predominantly through county or the community staff or their contractors planting those trees. But some of the groups, especially some of the grantees that are watershed groups or community groups, do have a volunteer component with that planting as well. Now we have a lot of other programs with our watershed partners and other partners where we do have a lot of volunteer plantings throughout the county, but through that program, it's primarily the communities and their contractors.
Excellent, thank you.
Ariel, if I might just add that, so for the grants that the state gives out, they generally require a one-to-one match, and you can use volunteer time as match for those grants. And so I would say, at least in Arizona, in my experience, a large proportion of the money that we grant for tree plantings uses volunteer labor to get those trees in the ground, because they can use that time as match, and that's really helpful for them. So I would say, at least in Arizona, there's a ton of volunteer time.
Excellent, thank you. Ian, do you have any perspective from the national scale of how many or how much volunteers are relied upon for these type of programs?
I don't have specific numbers. I would say volunteers are a critical component of it, but we really our ideal scenario is really creating those jobs where people are doing it on a consistent, regular basis. We really want to get numbers up and efficiencies. That's really the way to go. But in terms of just building that support and all that, the volunteer component is critical.
Excellent, thank you. So we haven't received any additional questions yet. So I, again, want to encourage our audience to pose questions for our panelists. But I do have one that I'd like each of you to address. Often in natural resources management, we're always talking about the challenges and how to overcome those. We're facing climate change, et cetera, that of course we know. I am curious if each of you could speak on some of the opportunities that you see within urban forestry and some of the things that you're particularly excited about in the next few years or so. So Jared, if you'd like to start for us.
Yeah, for us, the excitement is it seems like a very burgeoning realization of the importance of it, and a lot, at least locally here, there are a lot of people involved and groups involved with it and becoming more involved. The challenge with that then is coordinating all that effort and that energy, and I know Cori or Ian alluded to, I think Ian alluded to it as well, is, getting away from focus on just planting as many trees as possible. We got to take care of them and make sure they're actually going to grow and be trees and be canopy and provide all those services that, we like to talk about them providing. I think that's the biggest opportunity, is really just locally, there's a lot of awareness built with it. And then, even in those areas, think back to the map I shared, it showed Cleveland had a very low tree canopy. There are a lot of vacant lots and everything in Cleveland too. There are a lot of opportunities. We've really been trying to work with the county and the city on ways, how can we really work to find those areas where it makes sense, where there's not realistically going to be developed soon, where we could grow some cool projects.
Excellent. Thank you, Jared. We'll look forward to seeing what the district's able to do with some of those opportunities that come up. Cori?
Yeah, I think Jared took my answer, but I think that the excitement is twofold. One, that trees are being seen more in the light of this could be a real long-term solution for climate change. And as the realizations about climate change come into focus, there is more funding available now than I have ever seen in terms of doing these kinds of projects coming down from Congress. So very excited that there is a lot of capacity building that we can look to right now. And the challenge, like Jared said, is making sure that we use it responsibly and that it's self-sustaining. And here in Arizona, we have a real, we really want people to focus also, not away from tree planting, but also tree planting and maintaining the mature trees that you already have, because it's the mature trees that store the carbon and help you with climate change. So we really want to make sure that some of this newfound support is going to go towards that.
Excellent. Thank you. Ian?
I'll say kind of the same thing from the nonprofit side. Like, we're interacting with, like, I won't name names, but like some really, really big names in the private sector, public sector. That, like, we are just having a moment in our field. Like, we've stepped into the spotlight as a critical need, and like the New York Times reached out and we're like, hey, we want you to write an article, and it's got this whole, this big plaster thing that did all this data around it. So yeah, I think we're just having a moment. We need to take advantage of it. Like, one of my concerns is our field isn't really built to scale. Like, we had a big infusion of stimulus investment about a decade ago, and it really surged up and created a bunch of jobs, but they mostly all went away because organizations just weren't built to sustain that. So I think if we get more infusion, we need to be much more savvy about it and figure out how we can sustain that, so we're keeping these jobs long term.
Excellent. Thank you, Ian. And your work obviously on career building as well is super helpful, I imagine, in building some of that key infrastructure moving through time. So thank you both for those great responses too. So in that note as well, in terms of interacting with partners and building a longer term vision for urban forestry, we have a question regarding any examples of best practices for local tree commissions. So for example, tree conservation and increasing tree canopy. Do any of you have any comments on that question?
Well, I think the best resources that I've seen for tree boards or local organizations like that, actually the Arbor Day Foundation website, I'll just keep going back to it. They have a ton of resources for tree boards and ordinance writing and templates, and this is what you should be doing. So I would go to the Arbor Day Foundation website. That is a great place to start.
Also, I don't know if this is in other states, but in Ohio, the Division of Forestry puts on training a Tree Commission Academy for those that are serving on tree commissions. And that's a really good resource. It's a multi-step process.
Excellent, thank you. And on a similar note, do any of your states, or do you know of any resources that have programs that certify contractors who know correct ways of planting and maintaining trees? So it sounds like there's some poor practices in this individual's location.
Well, I will throw out ISA, International Society of Arboriculture. They are the kind of gold standard of that. If you're hiring someone, make sure they're ISA certified. They have different certifications for arborists and such.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say too, is when we give out money to for a project on the ground, we have to know that there's a certified arborist or similar attached to that project. And so we look to the ISA to give us those qualifications.
Something I'll say we've run into with the grant program, though, is they might have that arborist there kind of on staff or involved, but they're not always necessarily on site when those trees are getting planted. So really making sure they're involved all the way through. Or like I said, that's a big part of what we do through our program is on site to ensure that they are being planted correctly, because even, you know, you got certified people designing it. Sometimes they're on site and it's great, and sometimes they're not.
Excellent, thank you. And so for our last question, Ian, I'm going to direct this one to you. With the tree equity tool, is there any plans, or does it already cover smaller communities, smaller towns and communities?
Oh yeah, sorry, I just said that and send on that. But so we base our things off census numbers. So 50,000 and higher is a specific census category. So we're in discussions with a funder to do that next, the urban cluster of 2,500 to 49,000 population. That would be all of, then we'd have all of urban and community forestry covered, at least in the continental US.
Excellent, thank you. Great, we're just about out of time. So before we wrap up, I'd like to provide each of our speakers any an opportunity to note any last minute thoughts or resources or anything of that sort. Jared?
I don't think so. I'm good. But do check out our website if you're interested in some of the other tree programs we do. I think we have a lot of different kinds of things. If you check out our website under the programs tab, you can, under our Cuyahoga Relief, just a lot of different ways that we're involved with forestry in the community.
Excellent, thank you. Cori?
Yeah, I guess my parting thought will be, if you are not already connected with the state coordinator where you live, go to that Arbor Day Foundation website, find out who it is, and let them know what's on your mind. I think they have resources that you probably don't know about, and hearing from you only helps them do their job better.
Excellent, thank you, Cori. Ian?
I'll just say on the federal policy side, there's some really time-sensitive opportunities around infrastructure and just some bills. So if you want to reach out to your representatives and let them know how critical it is, a link. We're part of a coalition that's really pushing that with Trust for Public Land and Urban Sustainability Directors Network and Urban Drawdown.
Excellent, thank you so much. And on that, I'd like to thank again our speakers for these wonderful presentations. We'll have the link on our website soon to this webinar, and I'll send out some resources from them as well. So thank you very much to all of you for your time and contributions to today's webinar. I'd also like to remind our audience to look at NACD's website to learn more about some of our urban and community conservation programs. And please make sure to sign up for our publications if you haven't already, to receive all the latest news on Conservation District and partner activities. So with that, thank you again, everyone, and enjoy the rest of your day.